Cassidy, you can take it away.
All righty. Hi, everyone. My name is Cassidy O'Keen. I am the Associate Program Officer here at RISE. And I want to just welcome you to this intro to low barrier housing, and thank you so much for being here today. Before we get started, I want to give you all just a little bit of context about RISE and about this training and how we landed on it. So first, RISE is the only public-private partnership that is dedicated solely to funding solutions that end the opioid overdose crisis. We aim to have our work be led by those with lived experience and who are unafraid of new and novel ideas. So we aim to build capacity and build networks and create new programming with novel approaches and supporting our community partners who do this work every day to prevent overdose. And as part of that, in April, we offered a two-part learning community that was focused on housing and harm reduction. And Andrew was actually one of our panelists there. And the feedback we got from those sessions was overwhelmingly positive. And a major theme we kept seeing was that folks were asking for more training to support local low barrier housing providers. So we partnered up with Andrew and Housing First to offer not only this intro session, but in the next 6 weeks, we will be offering cohort-based learning sessions. So folks will be able to workshop real life scenarios and talk about some of the barriers that you're running into. And it'll be a really excellent opportunity to collaborate not only with the trainers from Housing First, but also with your colleagues who are also doing this work. So if you have not done so already and you are interested in joining those other series, I will drop my email in the chat, and you all can give me just a quick email about your name and I will sign you up for those sessions. I also want to let you all know that this session is being recorded and the other ones will as well. And we're aiming to have those posted on our RISE website, probably sometime towards the end of the month starting. So I'll go ahead and put the link to our website there so you can take a look at those when they come out and also just peruse and see some of the other awesome work that we're doing. I think the last thing that I want to just touch on before we jump in and I pass it back to Andrew is to acknowledge the wide range of folks we have in attendance today. We have government people, we have housing providers, funding partners, and so many different folks here today. And so I want to first say that everyone brings unique experience and expertise to this, and we value all of that. And we want to encourage you all to feel free to speak openly and freely with each other and use this as a collaboration time. That is all I have. So thank you all so much for being here again, and thank you for the amazing and hard work that you do every day. I'll go ahead and pass it back to Andrew. If you have any other questions though about the other sessions, again, feel free to email me at any time. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Cassidy. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Happy Tuesday afternoon. I hope everybody's week is going well so far. Super excited to be here with you. There's really loud music coming from a car passing by outside, but that's what happens when your office is in North Philadelphia. So hopefully that will not disturb us too much. Anyway, so my name is Andrew Spears. My pronouns are he, him, and his, and I'm the Director of Training and Technical Assistance at Pathways to Housing, PA. We're going to spend a lot of time today talking about low barrier housing, which is what we do at Pathways. So I won't give you too much of the background spiel, but we are a homeless services organization. We're based in North Philadelphia, and we've been using the Housing First model to help end chronic homelessness for single adults who are living with serious mental illness and or substance use disorders and other disabilities. We've been doing that since 2008 to much success. 85% of our folks stay housed after a 5-year period. And we've grown a lot over the years because of these successes. So we currently serve over 550 folks in individual apartments in a scattered site model here in Philadelphia. So many other programs have reached out to us over the years for, you know, like, what's the magic sauce? How are you doing this? Can you teach us how? And so we launched Housing First University, which is our outward-facing training and educational initiative in 2019 to start sharing some of those best practices with other communities in hopes to increase some of those success rates for other folks as well. So I was very privileged to get to participate in that event that Cassidy spoke about with some folks from the National Harm Reduction Coalition, and happy to be back with you here again today and to be working with folks in the harm reduction cohorts that are coming up. The other thing I want to say about kind of my background in approaching this work is before I came into a training role at Pathways, I worked in direct service for many years, including at Pathways. I was an assistant team leader and a team leader. And per Cassidy's, initiative of wanting to or Rise's initiative of wanting to promote the experiences of folks with lived experience in this field. I am also a person in long-term recovery from substance use with lived experience in the mental health system as well. So wanted to offer that to the conversation today. I'll toss it over to Ryan, my co-presenter, and then we'll get started.
Hey folks, it's great to be with you. My name is Ryan Villagran. I use he and they pronouns. I'm a training specialist with Housing First University. I've been here for just a bit over a year. And so I feel very privileged to be able to speak with you today and share some of this info as we do with folks across the country. So I'm really excited to have you here with us. And I hope that we'll be able to engage you such that the chat is really active. You're asking questions, offering comments, pushing back on ideas, and just getting the clarity that you need. So with that, let's move ahead to the housekeeping slides. We know that it can be so easy in a virtual format to, have your email up on a second screen, or, the work texts are coming through. And so as much as possible, we encourage folks to just be present with us. We invite you to be present with us today. It's about 2 hours that we'll be together. And so if you're able to kind of shut down the Outlook, or turn the phone over, we find that the conversations are more rich. We all get more out of it, and so we just encourage you to just focus in for a couple of quick hours if you can. We do have closed captioning available, and so if you need that or other accessibility needs, please reach out to us privately, and we will help you out there. For folks who are seeking CE credit, we are able to offer social work continuing education credit for any social workers who are licensed in the room. And so if you are seeking CE credit, please make sure to stay for the whole training, the duration of the training. If there are discussion questions, make sure you participate in those. And we do have one poll, and so make sure to respond to that poll. If you can do all of those things and you're interested in CE credit, we'll be able to get you a social work approved continuing education provider certificate that you'll be able to put towards your licensure. Andrew and I like to kind of have discussion and answer questions throughout trainings. And so if you have anything that comes up, throw it in the chat, raise a hand, get our attention in some way so we can answer your questions directly. We do have Q&A usually at the end of our sessions, but we would rather you get your needs met along the way. We don't want you to feel sort of lost as we go, or if you kind of have a thought about how to implement things in your program, we hope we can get some of those questions answered throughout instead of waiting to the end. And then for folks who are wanting a certificate, whether that be a continuing education certificate or just an attendance certificate, maybe you need to turn that in for work or just sort of keep track of the trainings that you attend, we do ask that you complete our short course evaluation form. So we'll drop a link to that at the end. And so in order to get a certificate, you got to make sure you complete that eval. All right, for our agenda today, we are going to touch a little bit on the history of the Housing First model as an example of low barrier housing and the way that we practice here. We're going to touch on the 5 key principles of Housing First. And so any program that espouses a Housing First approach or a low barrier approach would want to make sure that they're capturing these 5 key principles. We'll talk about the benefits and challenges of low barrier housing. It's not all sunshine and roses. It can be challenging sometimes, but it offers a lot of benefits too. So we hope to elucidate that. We'll compare a low barrier approach to more traditional models of housing. And so we can sort of compare and contrast and see the pitfalls with each of those. We'll talk about initiating services in a low barrier model. And we'll talk about some overlap in the way we bring in other evidence-based practices into the practice of low barrier housing to sort of smooth the bumps, to make sure that people are getting their needs met. And so there's a lot of other practice that we include in Housing First and low barrier housing. And then, as I mentioned, we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. So for our learning objectives, we hope by the end of today's session, you'll be able to recognize barriers to housing stability for folks with disabilities, individuals with disabilities. We hope you'll be able to identify 5 key principles of low barrier housing. And we hope you'll be able to explain the benefits of low barrier housing approaches versus traditional recovery-based housing models. And so with that, I would like to kind of hear a little bit about who's with us in the room. Cassidy mentioned kind of folks from a broad spectrum of the service sector. So if you wouldn't mind in the chat, drop your name, where do you work, perhaps your job title or your role, and then what specifically brought you here with us today. I'd like to get a sense of who's with us. We'll let the answers trickle in for a moment.
Awesome. I see a lot of folks dropping their names in the chat, wanting to learn more about housing first, rapid rehousing, case managers, housing search coordinator, harm reduction program manager. Awesome. Housing coordinator, case manager. Awesome. Welcome, everybody. We're definitely going to help you learn more about housing first and low barrier housing today. Thank you for all these. All right, we also want to ask, I'm going to launch a quick poll, a little temperature check, see who's in the room. So we would love to know, what's your level of experience with low barrier housing approaches? We've got 3 options for you. 1, I know a lot about low barrier housing. I work in a low barrier housing program or a housing first program. 2, I have some experience with or knowledge of low barrier housing. Or 3, I've never heard of this before. I know very little about it. What are y'all talking about? What am I doing here? Let those answers come in for a second. I see lots of folks still introducing themselves in the chat. Got Gretchen, who's new to the agency and the housing system. Cool, we're going to teach you some new stuff today, I think. Lisa's here wanting to learn. This is great. Thank you, everybody, for saying hi.
Darby, an MSW student. Love that. Welcome.
Oh, very cool. Very cool. All right, I'm going to give it like 15 more seconds. If you didn't answer this poll yet, quickly get in there. All right, let's see who we've got in the room. Looks like 37% of folks say, I know a lot about low barrier housing. I work in a low barrier housing program. That's awesome. I'm excited that y'all came to this session. You have a lot to contribute as well. Ryan and I know a lot about this stuff, but we're not the end all be all experts. So please use the chat, jump in, let us know, add things, tell us if we make a mistake or want to correct us on something. We are fallible and don't always know the most. If there's a new statistic that came out yesterday, we might not know it yet. So jump in here and talk and share your knowledge with us too, please. About half of the room says I have some experience with or knowledge of this stuff. And 16% say I know very little about this, or I've never heard of low barrier housing. We promise we're going to get you some more information and at least scoot you towards the I have some experience with or knowledge of by the end of the session. So, all right. Thanks everybody for sharing that with us. So let's dive right in and talk about what is low barrier housing? What is housing first? What are the differences between those 2 things? What are we talking about here? In order to do that, we got to first talk about what causes homelessness. Where does homelessness come from, right? In the chat quickly, put in, take off your social worker, trauma-informed hat for a second and drop in the chat some words or stereotypes that come to mind when we think about people experiencing homelessness. What does the general public think about people experiencing homelessness? What do politicians think about people experiencing homelessness? What do we see in the media about people experiencing homelessness? Drop some of those ideas in the chat. Yep, right off the bat. Addict, lazy, substance use. They must be a junkie. They don't want to work. They like living outside. The worthy versus the unworthy poor. jailbirds, dangerous, addicts, alcoholics, mental health issues, domestic violence, trauma. Exactly. Y'all got it, right? So we have this idea that like people become homeless either because they're lazy or they're crazy or they have some kind of other like issue going on, right? And it's a way of oversimplifying the causes of homelessness, right? Like we want to think in America, we have this idea that everything is like a personal choice, right? And realistically, we understand that homelessness is caused by a lot of things, right? They usually boil down to these two areas, environmental factors and individual factors. So environmental factors are things like housing costs, lack of housing availability, removal of institutional supports, maybe folks aging out of the foster care system, decreased job opportunities for folks or jobs that don't pay a living wage. Obviously, there's a whole history of like racist and exclusionary housing policies in the United States that we're still contending with, right? And the effects of those things. And then the individual factors are things like severe mental illness or substance use, sometimes cognitive impairment or chronic health conditions, trauma histories, folks returning from the military, lack of family support, right? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So odds are we all have people in our lives who we know and love who have experienced some of those things, right? Perhaps many of ourselves have experienced some of these environmental and individual factors. You know, there was a study that came out, I think a year ago, that said about 49% of Americans are ill-equipped to cover a $400 emergency expense, right? So for many people that are living alongside us in our world, in our communities, in our workplaces, $400 could be the difference between somebody having stable housing and possibly living unsheltered, right? So who are the chronically homeless, right? Because that's who we think of when we're talking about housing first in a lot of low barrier housing programs. So we go by HUD's definition of chronically homeless, right? So people who have been homeless for at least 1 year or have experienced homelessness multiple times, right? So 12 months consecutively or 12 months cumulatively over a 3-year period is what qualifies somebody as chronically homeless, right? So these are the individuals who are often considered not ready for housing because they're, you know, dealing with unmanaged mental illness or substance use disorders or various physical disabilities. These are the folks who have often tried and failed in multiple programs or have been unsuccessfully engaged by outreach workers, right? I love this quote from Hillary Melton, who's the executive director of Pathways to Housing in Vermont, right? So our Pathways in Philadelphia sprung out of the original Pathways office in New York City that was started in the early 90s. We've got 2 sister programs, the one in Vermont, and we have one in Washington, DC. And so Hillary from Pathways Vermont says, the mental health system as it is isn't accessible to thousands of individuals. What is it that we're doing wrong? Imagine a hungry person with a wallet full of money standing outside a restaurant, but not going in, right? The restaurant owner is changing his window display. He's offering specials. He's pumping the smell of fresh bread outside, and still the hungry person with a wallet full of cash won't come inside. That is what's happening with our mental health system of care and the people who need it most, right? So what we know is that people do not become homeless because of moral deficiencies, right? People become homeless for all kinds of reasons, but they stay homeless because of system failures and oversights. So anybody who's been in like social work school or psychology classes has seen this before, but just in case you haven't, this is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? So Maslow's hierarchy is this motivational theory of psychology proposed by Abraham Maslow in a 1943 paper called A Theory of Human Motivation. Now I'll say, we know now that Abraham Maslow actually borrowed a lot of these ideas from indigenous cultures that he studied alongside. So this is not his original intellectual property, but he's adapted it and it suits our purposes for this discussion, right? So Maslow argues that our basic human needs are comprised of these self-fulfillment needs, these psychological needs, and our basic needs, right? And he structures this in like a 5-tier pyramid, right? So it's hierarchical. And what we understand is that the needs lower down on the pyramid have to be satisfied before individuals can attend to the needs higher up, right? We can't have the point at the top of the pyramid unless we have all of those base layers leading up to it. So we see at the very bottom layers of the pyramid are our safety and security needs, and our physiological needs are things like food, water, warmth, and rest. And so having a home a roof over our head, protection from the elements, safety from the outside world, right, is in our basic level of need. And I would argue that things like changing your relationship to substances, or going to the doctor and getting a prescription for your mental health challenges, right? These fall higher up in the pyramid, right? They're in our psychological needs. Getting a job, going back to school, right? Starting a family. These are things in our self-fulfillment needs, right? We can't attend to these higher level needs unless our basic needs have been met first, right? Pretty simple idea. Most people understand this, but still, we hear a lot of argument from folks, who work in homeless services, particularly folks with lived experience, who say, well, I pulled myself up by my bootstraps and I just went out and got a job and stopped using drugs, and here I am today, and why can't everybody else do the same things that I did, right? So sometimes I like to walk folks through this little exercise. Like, let's play the tape through. Imagine you're an individual who's experiencing homelessness, right? And you recognize that you have a mental health, disorder that is causing a lot of problems for you. And you say, all right, I'm going to go see a psychiatrist and work on getting the right medications for myself. So you go to a doctor, you find a doctor somehow, right? You go to an outpatient clinic, you walk in, you're able to see a doctor, and the doctor diagnoses you with something and gives you a prescription. Great. That's a step in the right direction. Now think about, this is a person living unsheltered, right? Where are they going to store those medications? Are they going to carry them with them all the time? Do they carry all their belongings with them all the time? Are they going to hide them somewhere? How are they going to make sure those medications don't get stolen, right? Do they have transportation fare to get to the pharmacy? Can they walk to the pharmacy, or do they have to take a bus? If they have to take a bus, do they have the $2 to get on the bus, right? Does their medication require a copay? Do they have the money to pay for that copay, right? So let's say they're able to get the medication, they don't lose it, they're able to get to the pharmacy, fill it, all that stuff. They have a follow-up appointment to check in with the doctor in a couple of weeks to see how things are going. Do they have a calendar to remind them of that appointment? Do they know how to reschedule the appointment if they miss it for some reason? Again, do they have transportation fare to get back to that appointment? Now, we see lots of folks who are living unsheltered who are able to keep a cell phone and maintain a cell phone, right? So they can make a phone call to reschedule if they need to, or they can set a reminder on the calendar on their cell phone if they need to, right? So they have a cell phone with a calendar, they have an alarm that's going to wake them up for their appointment. But if they're sleeping on a park bench outside, right? Like, where are they going to charge their cell phone? So just thinking about all of these issues, right? Taking care of ourselves is just so much more complicated when we don't have stable housing, right? We all know that we need a home to be safe and to be healthy and to thrive. And so this idea of low barrier housing, or a housing first approach, means that we're providing permanent housing without precondition. And we know that that can help get people on a path to recovery and rebuilding their lives. So what is the housing first model specifically? Housing First is this evidence-based program model that assists individuals who are experiencing chronic homelessness, who are living with severe mental illness and or substance use disorders, by immediately offering rental subsidies and permanent supportive housing with no preconditions or barriers, no predetermined endpoint, and then wraparound supports, right, that assist the individual in maintaining that housing. So the Housing First model was founded by Dr. Samson Barris, who's a psychologist in New York City in 1992. So it's 2022. We've got 30 years of evidence of this program being effective, right? Housing First was added to SAMHSA's National Registry of Evidence-Based Programs in 2007. Since that time, it's been replicated in over 150 US cities and countries all over the world, including Canada, Denmark, Finland, France, Ireland, Japan, the United Kingdom, South Korea, et cetera, right? Canada, it's the national response to ending homelessness. In Finland, they are almost at functional zero for their homeless population because of employing the Housing First model. They've done incredible work. I'm sure folks have heard about what's gone on in Houston and the dramatic decline in homelessness in Houston by using the Housing First model, right? So our program, Pathways to Housing PA, I've mentioned we've been operating in Philadelphia since 2008, and we have these sister programs in Vermont and DC. So some of the benefits we see of the Housing First model and our approach to this work, I already mentioned we've got a 30-year track record of evidence that Housing First has been working in communities all over the world for a very long time. high fidelity housing first programs, and I'll define what that means in a few minutes, but high fidelity housing first programs typically report between 85 and 90% retention for individuals in their units after a 5-year period, right? What we see with Housing First is that it eliminates the need for more expensive programs. It increases medication compliance and treatment adherence for individuals in those programs. It decreases hospitalization time for folks. And we have increased reports of participant satisfaction, right? Which we really attribute to our efforts around community inclusion, family reunification, increased independence, et cetera, which are not always offered by traditional housing programs. Housing First programs using a scattered site model also have very quick startup time. We don't need to develop new housing. We don't need to build new buildings. We can rent vacant market rate apartments all over the city, you know, and then just move folks in typically within 2 weeks of first being engaged. And then of course, there's the wider community benefit, improved quality of life for both the individual who is now housed and for the community, right? We have fewer encampments, fewer tents popping up, fewer folks sleeping on the street. Symptoms of mental illness and substance use are moved indoors rather than happening in your local park or in your neighborhood, right? So Housing First or a low barrier housing approach can be really beneficial to all kinds of folks. So we mentioned, I know I'm moving really fast. We're trying to cover a lot of material for y'all, but I want to encourage folks to be jumping in the chat, asking questions as they come up. Ryan's going to keep an eye on it, and we'll tag team in and out of there. So making sure we getting your needs met. So the 5 key principles of a low barrier housing first approach, right? We talked about the problem of homelessness and where it comes from, right? But what we know is that homelessness is solvable, and we know how to do it. And these 5 key principles are the kind of first step in unlocking what that looks like. So when we think about low barrier housing and a low barrier approach to providing housing, or a housing first approach, and I'll really kind of use those things interchangeably, right? A housing first approach is different from a high fidelity housing first model, which I'll define in a couple of slides. But when we talk about a low barrier housing approach, housing first approach, we're really talking about kind of the same thing here. So here are the key principles to doing that, right? Immediate access to permanent housing with no housing-ness ready requirements, participant choice and self-determination, multiple pathways of recovery orientation, individualized and participant-driven supports, and social and community inclusion. So let's break down what those mean. Immediate access to permanent housing with no housing readiness requirements. We believe that everyone deserves a safe and permanent place to live, right? And everyone means everyone, right? Everyone in our community, no matter what we look like, what zip code we live in, what our political affiliation is, whether we're white, Black, Native peoples, Latinx, Asian, no matter what good or bad choices we have made in our lives, everyone deserves a safe, quality, and affordable home, right? Housing is a human right. It's not a privilege. It's not something we expect someone to earn. It's not a reward. We believe that treatment and recovery are secondary to these ideas of safety and shelter. We need to work on safety and shelter first. The other stuff will follow. And we don't believe in this idea of housing readiness. We believe everybody is ready for housing, right? We're not going to ask a hungry person if they're food ready, right? We're not going to ask a person without a home if they're housing ready. Participant choice and self-determination is kind of the second key principle here. So a low barrier housing first approach, or low barrier housing approach, has to be person-centered at its core, right? We want to be promoting the inherent worth and dignity of all folks that we're working with. The housing we offer to folks is going to be based on client preferences and availability. We want to empower folks to make decisions for themselves. We want to offer multiple service options and continual support. Folks get to choose what services they want to engage in and when. And participants really guide the course of treatment, right? They're selecting what services they want to access and when they want to start working on those things. The third principle, multiple pathways of recovery orientation. it's really about defining or redefining what recovery looks like for individuals, right? So helping to support participants in defining what recovery means to them, how it's going to look to them, right? So we're not forcing treatment or abstinence on anyone, right? We're offering it. We're helping folks get connected to those services if that's what they choose, but we're not forcing it on folks. It's very inclusive of peer support, right? Using folks with lived experience, making connections that are different, that are special, right? And that can really help guide the recovery process for folks. Obviously, housing first or low barrier housing is not possible without harm reduction. Programs that say they're a housing first program and are not using harm reduction are not a housing first program. It's not a low barrier approach if you're not using harm reduction. So promoting harm reduction strategies as much as possible, and then also recognizing that well-being is holistic. And so we're including social, recreational, educational, occupational activities in what recovery looks like for each individual. Fourth key principle, individualized and participant-driven supports means standardized policies are going to ignore individual experience, right? When I hear this joke, or it's a joke to me, it's not a joke to the folks saying it. When I hear people who are critics of a low barrier housing approach or a housing first approach, they say, housing first is one size fits all, and that just doesn't work for everybody. To me, that's just like, tell me you don't know anything about housing first without telling me you don't know anything about housing first. Housing first has no standardization, right? It is not one size fits all. It's actually quite the opposite, right? By not having kind of blanket rules or a standardized, policy for X, Y, and Z behaviors, this is why doing housing first is so challenging, right? But that's why it works, right? Because we recognize that everybody is coming to the table with different strengths, different barriers. They need different levels of support based on different times and what's going on in their lives, right? So there's no one size fits all. There's no standardization. We know that this challenges stigma and it challenges systemic barriers and it helps folks to heal, right? We're allowing folks to have access to the supports that they want on demand, right? We might offer something 1,000 times and someone turns us down, and that 1,001 time, they're like, okay, yeah, I will go to detox. I think that sounds like a good idea. We got to be ready to move on that, right? Like the window of opportunity can close at any moment. And so we have these supports ready to go, ready to set up for people to kind of jump on that as soon as they express that willingness, right? And again, we're offering choice in all areas of our programming. So we're allowing folks to choose what neighborhood they want to live in, where they want to engage in health services, who they want to see for their mental health needs, right? If they want to address their substance use, how and when, working on life skills, et cetera. And then the last key principle, which I think is often the one that's like most overlooked, is this idea of social and community inclusion. We think that housing should not stigmatize or isolate folks. This is why our program specifically doesn't use a congregate setting, right? So there's no building in our program where like those people live, right? That's the house where the crazy people live, or that's the house where all the people who do drugs live. We don't want that house in our neighborhood. So we can combat this kind of like not in my backyard attitude by integrating folks into the community just like everybody else. And then folks learn what it means to be a good neighbor by practicing being a good neighbor and observing what neighborly behavior looks like from their own neighbors. So we really encourage community integration and looking for ways to encourage folks to kind of get back into the world, get back into their communities and get involved once they have been housed. So looking for opportunities for meaningful social activity. Cultural, spiritual, civic engagement, right? Walking folks through financial wellness, helping folks to reconnect to family and friends and intimate relationships. So all of these 5 things are really what makes a low barrier approach, right? So I've talked a little bit about the housing first model versus the housing first approach or a low barrier housing approach. So I want to really distinguish between those two things. The housing first model, right, is an evidence-based practice. There's a manual, right? Where's my manual? It's this whole book, right? This is how you do the housing first model, right? It's prescriptive. It tells you this is how this rolls out. You use an ACT team or use an ICM team. There are these fidelity measures, right? So we talked about the 5 key principles, but the Housing First model, a high fidelity Housing First model, actually has 38 principles across 5 different categories, right? So uses, like I said, uses an ICM team or an ACT team. It really also stresses the separation of housing services and clinical services. So they can happen under one roof, but they don't happen by the same folks. So that's what the Housing First model, like in a very quick nutshell, is, right? The difference is a Housing First approach, or a low barrier housing approach, operates kind of under the philosophy of making services as low barrier and as accessible for possible, right? For folks as possible. So the idea is here, we're screening folks into our services, not screening folks out, right? Screening folks out is like, oh, they're not ready for housing because of X, Y, and Z behaviors. In a Housing First approach or a low barrier approach, we're saying, oh, they have X, Y, and Z behaviors. They should be in a low barrier program, right? So it's about inviting the folks who are sometimes the hardest to house or the most difficult to engage. Those are the folks that we want to be serving in these types of programs, right? And the Housing First approach or a low barrier housing approach needs to follow those 5 key principles, right? Without those 5 key principles, it's not a Housing First approach. It's not a low barrier approach. Many programs that we've worked with kind of want to pick and choose the easier parts of Housing First to implement, right? They want to offer low barrier housing services, but they don't want to do harm reduction work, right? Your success rates are not going to be comparable. That's just the cut and dry of it, right? Like you can pick and choose the parts that feel easy to you, but don't expect to see an 85 to 90% housing rate, retention rate with those folks. So a little bit about that. So I want to touch on some of the benefits and challenges, and this is something that could be an entire 2-hour training in and of itself, but I'll give you some of the highlights here. So I do really love this slide. We borrowed this from a presentation on supportive housing and social determinants of health that CSH did a number of years ago, but some of the impacts that we see of supportive housing on health, right? Once folks are off the street and inside, we know that we can help prevent the onset of new illness or injuries, right? We can improve somebody's access to high quality coordinated health or behavioral health care, other critical social services. And we know that we can promote lifestyle behaviors that lead to good or better health for folks, right? So when we're moving an individual off the street and into a home, we're creating both a sense of physical healing and psychological healing, right? Individuals are going from an outcast in the community to a valuable member of the community, just like everybody else. So let's dispel some of the myths about low barrier housing and Housing First approaches, right? It's not a new radical idea. We've been doing this for 30 years. So it's not, there's a lot of folks that are still like treating Housing First like it's just this newfangled idea that somebody just came up with, and why are we trusting it? No, we actually have a 30-year track record at this point. So we know that it works. Housing First or a low barrier housing approach does not mean housing only. Putting somebody in an apartment and just leaving them there to like smoke cigarettes and watch TV all day is not what this is about, right? We provide wraparound services that are based on individual needs, right? As our clients or participants identify them, right? And that's what supports folks in maintaining that housing successfully. Without the support services, it's not going to work. It's just not going to work. And a lot of the critics of Housing First programs say Housing First is just housing only. And if services are voluntary and folks don't engage, then they're going to fail. Well, services are voluntary, but what we found is when we prioritize the choices and preferences of our clients and let them make decisions about what they want to pursue, what services they want to engage in, and in what order, they do engage in services. It's when you force services down somebody's throat that they're not interested in, that they're not going to engage, right? So Housing First is not housing only. Low barrier housing does not mean just getting somebody in an apartment and letting them sit there, right? It's about how do we identify what services somebody wants and then provide those services on the timeline that makes sense for that individual. Low barrier housing also does not mean anything goes, right? It doesn't mean there's no accountability for folks in the program. Offering folks choice does not mean ultimate choice all the time, right? It doesn't mean that folks never face consequences for their actions, right? Like as folks make choices that don't really serve them in their housing stability, like the number of choices available to people will narrow over time, right? Doesn't mean that folks are never going to get evicted. It just means we are going to support folks in rehousing them and addressing the behaviors that led to that eviction in the first place. We hear a lot of folks say that housing first or low barrier housing can also be like a threat to the safety of other people. And I want to really push this idea that the link between violence and mental illness is a false stereotype. It's a false equivalent, right? It's far more often individuals with serious mental illness are the victims of crimes rather than the perpetrators of crimes, right? So if you hear folks in your community kind of talking about this, I really think it's important to promote the, again, the inherent dignity and worth of all of our participants, and to dispel some of these myths about folks with mental illness just being dangerous and not fit to live in the community beside everybody else. Housing first is not, or a low barrier housing approach, we also don't see as enabling, right? We don't think that it's enabling to provide people with their basic human needs, right? Typically talking about enabling, right, is, Ryan has eloquently put it in a blog, right? It's code. It's code for saying, I believe these folks haven't suffered enough. They deserve more suffering before they have earned their housing, right? So usually the folks making these criticisms, right, they're doing so from the comfort of their homes. They're able to live comfortably inside and raise their families. So why shouldn't we enable all the folks in our communities to be able to do the same thing? We also don't believe that housing first or low barrier housing is an intervention that only works for a specific population, right? This approach was developed to serve folks with the highest level of need in our system, right? The folks who have not been able to make it work in other programs. So it is a model or an approach that is transferable to all different types, right? You've already been serving folks in your programs with varying levels of need, right? If you find that you don't have everything in-house you need to serve individuals with this high level of need, well, that's where your community partnerships come in, right? We have to challenge ourselves to not assume that people are going to fail from the gate, right? We have to approach this work with the belief that everyone is capable of recovery and everyone is capable of being successful in independent living, right? And then I already kind of mentioned this, but I want to drill it home again. Common criticisms of low barrier housing as this one size fits all approach is the fastest way to identify that somebody does not know what they're talking about when they're talking about housing first or low barrier housing, right? So what makes housing first so successful and low barrier housing so successful for these folks who have not been able to succeed in other programs is that it's highly individualized and it's based on everyone's individual goals, strengths, barriers, and history, right? That's also what makes it challenging, but it's what makes it so successful. So I talked about some of the benefits, right? But realistically, there's a lot of challenges in this work as well. We see that congregate settings can be a little chaotic, right? When we're doing a low barrier housing approach, what happens when you're balancing the needs of folks who are interested in maintaining sobriety with the needs of folks who are not ready to change their relationship to substances yet, right? That's hard work. There's no easy answer. I can't tell you exactly how to do that. It's going to depend on your clients, your population, your program rules and policies, where you're located, all of these different factors, right? Similarly, housing first work and harm reduction work with families can be really challenging, right? What does it mean to balance the needs of vulnerable children with folks, adults who maybe are not ready to address their substance use, right? These things are really challenging. It involves a lot of teamwork, a lot of discussion, a lot of applying the principles of ethical decision-making, right? We also know that the system is not oriented to serve those with the highest level of need, right? We're doing a lot of kind of like makeup work and backpedaling for folks who have been neglected by the system for so long that when they reach our programs, they reach our services, they're not always in great shape, right? And it can be really hard to address all of those high level of needs concurrently with somebody who's kind of new to our programs. Folks with chronic health conditions, we do see sometimes cannot be successful in independent living, depending on their level of understanding of their health condition, their proximity to the medical services that they need, right? Sometimes we need to bring in a home health aide or transfer someone to a skilled nursing facility or a nursing home, right? So chronic health conditions can impede somebody's ability to live independently at times. We also know that our client populations often have complicated relationships with the folks who have been their social support historically, right? So folks experiencing homelessness are super resourceful and super community oriented a lot of the time, right? Living in encampments, helping each other meet each other's needs, right? So when one person gets housing, they often feel guilty and they want to bring along the folks who are helping them to survive when they were unsheltered. This is coming from a good place, right? But sometimes it's going to challenge that person's ability to stay in their new unit. If it's a lease that's for one person and they're bringing along 12 of their friends with them, their heart's in the right place, but this is creating challenges, right? For that individual, for the program, for the landlord, for the other neighbors, right? So that can be a really challenging line to walk and to navigate with folks. Also, in programs where client choice is prioritized, and individualized treatment is really like kind of the MO, right? It's hard to anticipate how these programs will unfold for each individual, right? So consumer choice can mean that there's a level of unpredictability. We have to be really flexible and really nimble in our approaches when we're working from this kind of low barrier orientation. We also know that the folks that are coming into our programs are going to have varying, levels of need. So again, some folks might need a congregate setting because they actually don't like living alone, right? They don't like living independently. They want other folks around. Some folks might need more home visits when they first start out in our programs until they stabilize, and then we can kind of back off a little bit and only see them once every other week, right? But we need to, again, like these kind of like standard approaches where we do the same thing for everyone are not going to work because folks come in with varying levels of needs. And maybe running through all of those challenges, it doesn't sound easy, right? But the idea of like, hey, somebody doesn't have a home, let's give them a home and then work on all of the other things they need to work on. Like that conceptually sounds like a pretty easy lift, but it's not, right? And I'm sure y'all know this because you've worked in these programs, right? It's an easy idea, but it's actually a very complex intervention, right? It requires practice, it requires supervision, translating these principles and procedures into day-to-day decision-making based on client input. It's going to require a lot of training and a lot of supervised practice, right? We can't do these things, siloed from one another, right? We need to be having conversations. We need to be relying on our teams to make these decisions. I don't want to talk too much about harm reduction, but I do want to maybe whet folks' appetite a little bit for what we're going to do in these harm reduction cohorts and really encourage folks who haven't signed up yet to think about attending, because I think we're going to do some really interesting and helpful work in these sessions. But I want to talk just briefly about the role of harm reduction when it comes to low barrier housing, right? Housing itself is a form of harm reduction, right? The goal is to keep people safe in their homes. We're automatically keeping people safer and healthier once we put them in a unit than they would have been outside, right? Living on the street. We know that there are going to be problems sometimes though, right? Like folks are going to engage in behaviors that challenge their ability to remain housed. So the way that we apply harm reduction to that is we focus on the reduction of the specific behaviors or patterns that are challenging somebody's tenancy, right? We can teach people what it means to keep a low profile and stay off the landlord's radar, right? If the landlord is receiving continuous complaints about a participant who's partying until the wee hours every single night, right? We can talk to somebody about what would it mean to take a party to your buddy's house next week, right? Or maybe you only have your parties on your Friday nights and your Saturday nights, and the rest of the week you kind of keep it a little bit quieter, right? Folks don't always know what it means to be a good tenant if they've never been a tenant before, right? If they've never had a place of their own, they're not automatically going to know how to keep up with it, how to keep their neighbors happy, their landlord happy, right? So we can set up systems to reduce risk. If we notice that somebody is having a big party that irritates all the neighbors on the 1st or the 2nd of the month, maybe that's linked to somebody getting a big wad of cash in their hand on the 1st or 2nd of the month. And maybe we can talk to someone about budgeting their money, right? Like maybe instead of you getting a big lump sum on the 1st, maybe we break it up into weekly payments or bi-weekly payments, right? And so there's less money to throw a big party with, and then the person is like scrounging for food for the rest of the month, right? So there are ways that we can set up systems that reduce risk and help people be more successful, right? Supportive monitoring for safety maintenance, right? How often are we visiting people in their homes? When folks are having a hard time, are we increasing the amount of support, right? I think a lot of times we see folks in programs that are expressing a lot of need and displaying a lot of problematic behaviors. And what we do is we say, oh, this is not the right level of care for that person, right? They need a higher level of care. But what does it mean to actually keep somebody in place where they are and maintain that stability and just provide them with more support in that environment, right? So in this work, we can't expect overnight miracles, right? We can't expect that somebody is automatically going to go from living unsheltered outside to being a model tenant in their unit, right? There's going to be a learning curve for everyone. 100% elimination of a problematic behavior is not necessarily going to be possible, and it's certainly not going to be possible right away, right? So this is the idea of we want to meet people where they're at, but we don't want to leave them there either, right? What does it mean to meet somebody where they're at and then push them towards making better choices about their health, about their well-being, about how they're spending their time, how they're maintaining their unit and getting along with other people, right? So it's our job to help our participants identify what behaviors maybe are no longer serving them now that they're housed, right? And assist them with aligning their behaviors and their goals, right? Some folks will say, yeah, I love my apartment. I want to live here forever, right? But their behaviors are not indicating that they want to live there forever, right? Like those behaviors are like, no, you're going to get evicted, right? So how do we point out those discrepancies to help folks make better decisions, right? Another thing that's a really important lesson for our case managers when they're new to Pathways and they're going on their first home visits is what we're looking for is a functional house, not necessarily a beautiful house, right? We all come into this work with our own kind of ideas about what a healthy home looks like. And often our participants' homes don't look like what you or I would want our home to look like, right? And we're going to carry some bias about that and some judgments about that. But we need to be careful to not center our own values or our own expectations when we're working with folks who are newly housed or have a history of chronic homelessness, right? Things like how well decorated and how neat somebody's home is might not be the participant's concern. We see it as a concern, but to them, they're like, it's fine. I don't care if there are papers on my floor, right? So the difference between like a functional house and a beautiful house, right? A house that is messy, right? Has papers and clothes everywhere is still functional. A house that has a bed bug infestation is not functional, right? So that's the difference that we're looking at here. So not pushing that a home needs to meet our standards of how beautiful it is, right? And again, this idea of highly individualized stuff, right? We're recognizing that our participants are at different stages of their recovery from substance use, from mental health, their recovery from homelessness, right? So our interventions need to be tailored to someone's stage of change, right? It's going to take a lot of creativity, a lot of patience, a lot of ingenuity in order to be able to do this work to meet specific needs of individual folks. So the common concerns we see in low barrier housing, right? People missing their home visits, folks who don't really have the cleaning skills in order to maintain a pest-free or an odor-free environment. We see a lot of folks causing water damage because they forget to turn off their sink or they're washing their clothes in the bathtub. And I can't tell you how many times we've had like major water damage issues because somebody doesn't know how to use their shower curtain, right? So some of these like very simple life skill things, I hear case managers say, well, I can get a master's degree in social work to like teach somebody how to take out the trash. And it's like, well, if you're working in a low barrier housing program, that is exactly what you did, right? Because these life skills are absolutely vital to people's recovery, right? So we need to do all of that work up front. We actually developed this, I think, amazing tool called it's their welcome home packet. When they're new to a unit, they get this welcome home packet that's like, hey, welcome to your new home. Here's some information that's going to help you be comfortable here. And in that packet, you go through it with the individual who's newly housed, and you write what their trash day is. And you write like, you should probably bag up your trash and take it out the night before, but don't take it out before 5 p.m. because you could get a ticket, right? For best practices to not get bugs, you should do your dishes at least once a day. Here's how you use your shower curtain, right? We take these things for granted because someone taught them to us when we were very young. A lot of our work with participants in low barrier housing programs, it's not rehabilitative work, it's habilitative work. It's skills that someone never learned in the first place. So we need to teach these things to folks in order for them to be successfully housed, right? So we'll see structural and cosmetic damages to the units, right? We keep some contingency funds on hand to repair those things. Mental health symptoms, intoxication causing disturbances to neighbors, right? These are clinical issues that our case managers are going to be talking about with folks during every single home visit, right? We keep bringing it up. We identify the discrepancy between somebody's stated goals and their behaviors, and we help folks get those things in line with one another, right? So none of these reasons, right? They're all concerning. They all pose problems, but none of these should be a reason to deny someone housing, right? Because somebody doesn't know how to clean their apartment and gets a roach infestation, that doesn't signal that someone can't live independently. That signals that somebody needs some coaching, or maybe if they can't actually clean their apartment, we allocate some funds to have cleaners come in twice a month to make sure that that doesn't happen in the future, right? There are ways that we can kind of set up systems that reduce risk for folks and keep folks, housed, right? So what's important to note here also is that all of these issues occur for all types of people and all types of tenants, right? Landlords deal with these same issues with folks who are not in programs. So when they are in low barrier housing programs or housing first programs, landlords at least have a responsible party to call to say, can you help me out with this person and this issue that's going on? Because certainly they're dealing with this stuff all the time, right? But this kind of work is challenging, and it's not for folks who are risk averse, right? If you are not willing to take on any risk in housing folks with this high level of need, then a low barrier approach or a housing first approach probably isn't the kind of work for you, which is fine because we need all types of housing programs, right? We need abstinence only housing for the folks who need that, right? We need low barrier housing for the folks with this level of need. I got 2 o'clock on the dot. I've been talking nonstop at you, but I do think looks like things are landing. So hopefully folks are hearing some helpful information. Let's take a 3-minute stretch, go refill your coffee, use the bathroom, get some water, whatever you need to do. And when you come back at 2:03 or 2:04, we'll spend some time comparing low barrier approaches to sort of traditional housing models. So I'm gonna pause the recording and we'll see you in a few minutes. I think folks are making their way back. Looking over the chat, looks like folks had some good questions or comments. Please feel free to keep those rolling in. I want to offer a moment if anybody here has any kind of outstanding questions and wants to jump in for a moment before we tackle this next section. And that'd be a great time. All right, I'm gonna keep moving then. So gonna take a moment and compare sort of what we've been talking about, this low barrier approach, the housing first approach, to what we've seen traditionally in homeless services, right? So when we think about homeless services, it's typically things like shelters, safe havens, cafes, right? These sort of temporary interventions for folks experiencing homelessness. We might have drug and alcohol or mental health programs that are longer term inpatient, or these residential facilities tailored to individual kinds of needs, right? You've got your local housing authority, you've got your skilled nursing facilities or your medical respite programs, right? All of these programs have specific rules that folks have to follow in order to become eligible or remain eligible to be housed, right, and to engage in treatment. Many or most shelters, residential facilities, treatment programs, et cetera, right, require sobriety and have a limited capacity for dealing with disruptive psychiatric symptoms, right? Because a lot of these programs are dealing with all kinds of folks, right? Folks who are experiencing mental illness or don't have any mental health history, right? Folks with substance use disorders and folks who are not contending with those issues, right? So thinking about what navigating shelter looks like, thinking about these folks with this really high level of need that low barrier housing programs, housing first approaches were kind of developed to serve, right? Are folks who are experiencing chronic homelessness with severe persistent mental illness and or substance use disorders. This is an example of what it can look like to navigate shelter, right? I have a master's degree and have been doing this work for quite some time. And if I try to follow this, I get a headache, right? This is pretty overwhelming and confusing. So imagine, like, when's the last time you had a good night's sleep? You've been sleeping on a park bench outside, exposed to the elements, worried your stuff is going to get stolen. Have you had a good meal in a while? Are you hydrated, right? Like, even when I'm at my best, looking at this feels overwhelming. So trying to navigate the system when you have no stable roof over your head already, right? Like limited, like resources. Can you get around to all of these places? It's a lot. So linear residential treatment is what we kind of call like traditional housing services or like recovery-based housing services. So those shelters, those halfway houses, residential treatment programs, right, are usually based on the therapeutic milieu model, right? So what we traditionally used in psychiatric hospitals, right? So usually there's some kind of like level system where you earn privileges by following the rules, right? The rules are usually things like maintaining sobriety, participating in treatment, going to group, getting along with everybody else there, right? Like you live in an environment where everyone is recovering together and we expect that everyone follows these same kind of rules. So it's typically like I said, these drop-in centers, safe haven shelters, transitional housing, places where your stay ranges anywhere between like 6 and 24 months. So it's not permanent, right? If you behave well in those programs, you might eventually get connected to permanent housing. So places like community residences, small or large single room occupancy programs that have like social services on site. Sometimes we'll see some independent and shared apartments or mixed use buildings. What I really want to note about these types of programs is that linear residential treatment is very widely used, but it is not empirically based, right? It is not scientific. It is not, we have studied this and found that it works. It's just the way that we thought we should do things and the way that it's always been done, right? Until the low barrier or housing first approach came along, right? So we don't have a lot of good studies showing success of these programs. There's typically between a 24 and a 40% housing retention rate in linear residential treatment programs compared to the 85 or 90% housing retention rate we see in housing first oriented approaches, right? So why is that? When we compare housing first or low barrier housing to these traditional models, well, in these traditional permanent supportive housing models, we often see social services attached to the site, right? The site where folks live is also where they receive their services. And if it's a congregate setting that is an abstinence only, right? Like you can't have any new use, it's not a harm reduction program, right? What happens if somebody has a relapse or experiences new use, right? They're gonna get evicted. This is a program where you can't do that. There's people trying to maintain sobriety and you use, so you've got to go, right? That's not what we do here. So what happens is that individual has now lost their home and they've lost all the supports that were associated with that home, right? Because the supports are site-based. And if the staff is site-based, they're not following that person out into the community to provide them with new supports, right? They get shuffled along to a brand new provider where they got to make brand new relationships all over again. This is like that idea of like, oh, this is not the right level of care for someone. They need a higher level of care. And a higher level of care usually means we're discharging you and now you have no connection to these supports that have been here for you historically, right? So essentially what's happening is someone is in a housing program, but that housing is tenuous, right? It's dependent. The housing is a reward for compliance with treatment. The housing is your reward for jumping through the hoops and following the rules, right? I think this is kind of coercive, right? It violates the therapeutic alliance. It doesn't respect that not everyone wants to take medications for various reasons, right? Not everyone wants to change their relationship to substances right away. And it ignores that substance use exists on a spectrum, right? It ignores a lot of the individualized needs of the folks that we're working with. So essentially what we're doing is we're punishing folks for displaying symptoms of their co-occurring disorders. If you need to have a serious mental illness or a substance use disorder in order to get into this program, and then we expect you to automatically stop using all substances, even though we understand addiction as a chronic relapsing condition, right? Sometimes. So you have to have a substance use disorder to get into this program, but the second you step foot over the threshold into the doors of our facility, you can never use drugs again or you're going to get evicted, right? So you have to have this condition, but you can't show us any of the symptoms of that condition once you get here. Or you have to have a serious mental illness, but once you get into the program, you can't show symptoms of that. You can't be disruptive to the therapeutic milieu, right? You can't distract other people in group or have an episode late at night and wake other people up, right? So is this really the ethical way of doing things? And does this make sense for the folks with the highest level of need, right? This is the reason that chronic homelessness exists, because folks with this high level of need, right, are not being served by the programs that have been there set up for them, right? It's hard for folks to jump through these hoops. These are the individuals that we consider treatment resistant or hard to house, right? Because they haven't been able to meet the requirements or the rules and policies of these programs, which are essentially turning Maslow's hierarchy on its head, right? So folks are provided with this like temporary housing, but again, it's not the same as permanent supportive housing where you're like, this is my place, this is where I live. This is a place where I am allowed to stay right now that could be taken away from me at any moment. And so while you're existing with that fear of maybe I won't have a place to rest my head tomorrow, and I'm not guaranteed a meal tomorrow if I don't behave well enough, right? Then how are folks going to be able to start managing their mental health symptoms, stop using all substances, be on time for curfew, get along with everyone, find a job, follow the rules, right? And then eventually, when you have done all of these desirable behaviors, performed all of these behaviors for us, and then we'll connect you to housing because you've earned it and it's a reward, right? I don't think this is the ethical way to approach things. I don't think this serves the folks in our system with the greatest level of need. So when we put linear residential treatment side by side with this low barrier approach, here's what we see. Linear residential treatment says the provider knows what's best. You've got to do what we tell you to do because that's how you're going to be successful. A low barrier, oh, my slides are all out of order. All right, let me just click all this through and then we can go through it. So linear residential treatment, provider knows best. Low barrier approach says, actually, we think the client is the expert on their own life and their needs and what they want, right? Linear residential treatment is based on clinical assumptions about what our clients are or are not capable of, whereas a low barrier approach is based on the belief that everyone can be successful if they're provided with the right individualized supports for them. Linear residential treatment says our clients have to demonstrate desirable behaviors in order to earn and keep their housing, whereas a low barrier approach says housing is a basic human right and everybody deserves a safe space to call home. Linear residential treatment is this idea that clients have little say in their trajectory for housing, right? It's like, take what you can get. This is what's available for you. This is all you get. Low barrier approach says we're going to actually offer you choice at every stage as often as possible, right? In linear residential treatment, individuals who are disruptive to the milieu are going to lose their housing and their supports when they're discharged. Whereas low barrier housing, discharge is really seen as a last resort. We're doing as much as we can to keep people housed. And then linear residential treatment is all about standardized policies, right? if this, then this, right? When you behave this way, this is the consequence. But in low barrier approaches, there's no one size fits all. Everything's individualized to meet client needs. And that's why we see it as more successful. So I really think that perhaps the most valuable lesson that we can learn from these low barrier approaches is that clients who have seemingly been incapable or incapacitated, who face multiple challenges, are in fact able to set and meet their own goals for housing and treatment if they are provided with the right resources and the right support. Just some of the statistics that we've seen in program evaluation, right? After 6 months of first starting our program in 2008, we saw for our folks that we were working with, shelter episodes decreased by 88%, crisis response center episodes decreased by 71%, CBH, psychiatric hospitalizations, those episodes decreased by 70%, and involvement in the Philadelphia prison system, those episodes decreased by 50%, right? So this is what we see when we individualize our approaches and when we treat our clients as the experts on their own experience. I toss it over to Ryan to talk for a little while so I can take a break.
So yeah, let's talk a little bit about what it looks like to initiate services using a low barrier approach. And so first we want to talk a little bit about who qualifies for such programs. And so low barrier housing was really designed to meet folks with a high level of need. And so, you know, that's who we target. So specifically, we're working with folks who are adults, usually 18 and above. We're working with folks who have serious mental illness. And so that can include active symptoms or perhaps a history of hospitalization. Folks with co-occurring disorders. And so it may include folks with pretty severe substance use or a range of substance use, along with serious mental illness. And also folks who are experiencing chronic homelessness. And so, as Andrew mentioned, we use the HUD definition there. So folks who have experienced homelessness for 12 consecutive months or for 12 months over a 3-year period. We'll also tend to prioritize folks who have other high levels of need, right? So folks experiencing chronic acute health conditions, folks who are intensely involved in the criminal legal system or a history of such, and then any other issues that might disqualify them from housing and other programs, right? And so often the folks that we serve are folks who have been through the system quite a bit. They've been in a number of housing programs, and it's like folks who have been labeled as unready for housing or like not appropriate for housing yet or something like that. So folks would have been through the linear residential treatment kind of milieu, and that can't seem to stick, right? And so we'll tend to try and prioritize those folks based on what their needs are. So while we think, while low barrier housing, I think, supports folks with these needs that you're seeing on the screen, we do think the model can work for any population. And so we love when we can see examples of that elsewhere. And so in terms of referrals, usually folks who could benefit most from low barrier housing approaches are identified by outreach workers, right? Like homeless street outreach workers who are pounding the pavement, they're under the bridges, they're alongside the rivers here in Philadelphia. They're sort of finding folks out there who have been out there for a long time, and they're documenting all of these contacts over the years. And so you're also seeing folks with a high level of, there's a pretty big Venn diagram of folks that we serve and high utilizers of these other systems, right? So folks who are frequently at drop-in centers, frequently at shelters, folks who are quite frequently utilizing emergency departments and hospitals, and usually in like, multiple times a month, multiple times a week, even folks who with a history of psychiatric hospitalization and frequent psychiatric hospitalization, folks again who have criminal legal involvement, and so we're kind of coming into contact with folks through their forensic case managers, and then we have these diversionary courts that are often places where we receive referrals, right? Mental health courts, drug courts, things like that. In terms of engaging folks, this is such a crucial part of the process. We're dealing with folks who have been through many systems, right? Have worked with a bunch of outreach workers or mental health providers or substance use providers, And so engagement is really a vital stage in this process because folks are getting their first impression of our program through this initial engagement. And so we as staff members making that first impression have an opportunity to really translate those 5 principles, the kind of philosophy behind low barrier approaches into clinical practice, right? Like this is our opportunity, that first meeting and those first couple of meetings to kind of translate all of these beautiful ideals into practice where we're actually in communication with folks. And so we're really striving, especially in these early meetings, to kind of avoid the hierarchical power relationships that can exist between providers and participants, and really recognizing that folks are experts on their own lives and their own experiences. We're there to kind of learn from them about themselves and support them with whatever needs that they have. And so this early engagement is where we have to really demonstrate a high level of care, a high level of concern for their needs, a high level of compassion. And so we often have to be quite reassuring, quite patient. You know, folks don't necessarily want to hear from us. Who's this new person who is like up in my encampment, trying to talk to me, trying to build a relationship with me? And so it really takes quite a lot of assertiveness and patience on our part to really approach people, build relationship over some period of time, and eventually get them into a unit. You know, we've got units ready to go. I can walk up to you on the street and say, hey, you're eligible for our program. You've been referred to us. Let's get you into an apartment. And that can be in as short of a time period as 2 weeks. But often there's a process that has to unfold where people are like developing trust with us, trying to understand what we're about. Is this real? And so that takes quite a bit of patience. Clients know what their needs are and have clear preferences about their lives, about recovery. And so in recognizing that, we really have to kind of allow the clients to set the pace, right, in terms of identifying goals in those initial meetings. And if folks are unsure and they want us to take on the role of kind of steering the conversation a little bit, we have to be prepared to do that too. But we're always kind of taking the pace of the participant, understanding what their needs are, understanding what goals they want to kind of prioritize. And what we know is that if we try and push a goal down somebody's throat, they're going to be unlikely to pursue that goal. People are going to pursue the goals that make the most sense to them. What are their goals? And so if we just sort of follow them, we're much more likely to sort of achieve all of the things that we want to achieve on their behalf as well. We may do it in a different order than maybe we would prioritize in our own lives, but that's not up to us, right? People know their own needs. They know what their goals are. We also have to be flexible enough to kind of meet those priorities. Yeah, like I know I got to get a psych eval done with you pretty early on in the process, but you want to do a bunch of other stuff. You want to make sure that you get your ID taken care of so that you can pursue a Social Security application. Fine. We have to be flexible enough to kind of follow your lead as a participant. And our program affords us that patience, that flexibility as well. Sometimes we approach folks on the street who don't want housing or don't seem to want housing. It's like, hey, we got a unit for you. Let's get you in 2 to 4 weeks. Let's do it. And they're like, I don't know you. Get away from me. I don't want to work on that. I don't want to come inside. And so we have to really practice radical acceptance in those moments of their point of view, right? Like we don't know what they've been through. We're taking a really trauma-informed lens in terms of what have you experienced in your life? What do you need right now? And we have to understand that housing may not be the priority for some folks. But we do continue to engage until that changes. And we're asking what other goals they want to work on. Fine. You want to get reconnected with your family first. Let's do it. And so we can sort of demonstrate our reliability and trust with folks when we can follow their lead and when we can engage them to work on the goals that they set for themselves. Sorry. Sometimes participants will have reservations in even having us come near them. And this comes from a bunch of different places. Other providers have disappointed them along the way, perhaps promised housing. Like you can do this like stepwise approach. You start in the shelter and then maybe we'll get you into transitional housing, demonstrate your sobriety, and maybe you'll move into permanent supportive housing. And they've been let down by a number of promises in the past. And so that makes a lot of sense for them to be skeptical, right? Of us new people coming in and offering them housing, offering them services. Sometimes that skepticism can also be linked to mental health issues, right? There's a level of paranoia that may exist for some folks. And so there are a bunch of reasons why participants might have reservations. We need to be sort of flexible enough to work with any of that and roll with any of that as it comes up. We also know that engagement can last for a long time. This engagement process, it's an intervention. It's not just like a, let me come talk to you and get the psych eval done. It's an intervention that can unfold over many months. And we have stories of folks here at Pathways that have been with us for some time that took years, literally years, like 8 years for some folks to finally agree to come inside. And so really the key here is follow through. Folks are used to being disappointed. They're used to us not following through as kind of a service system. And so we have to really take responsibility for ensuring that folks receive the services that they request in the order that they request them. And so again, demonstrating that trust can eventually lead to successful engagement and enrolling in the program and getting folks housed and getting their needs met. And so this engagement process, as I mentioned, as an intervention, it's really that coming together of all of this philosophy stuff that we're talking about. It really sounds very beautiful, as Andrew has described it, but it's kind of where the rubber meets the road, where we're actually like, now this is true. Here's how we envision a low barrier housing, and here's how it's going to look for you, and join us on this process. In terms of program expectations, we have to be so clear with folks right from the get-go, right? So that we're not another provider who's just failing to meet their expectations, who's not reliable, and who's not trustworthy. And so we're clear with the program expectations right from the jump. And because we know that the clearer we are from the beginning, the smoother the things are gonna kind of unfold throughout their tenure with us in the program. We do offer people the opportunity to kind of choose or modify or refuse services at any time, right? Like if I decide I want to start an MAT program, but then I decide it's not for me and I want to do something else, or I want to pursue, a work first program or some kind of vocational rehabilitation, fine, let's roll. We can sort of move as a participant decides. There are times when we need to sort of, there are some things that are requirements though, right? And so this is going to vary from program to program. If we're offering low barrier housing, there are going to be some touch points where we say, yes, we'll choose, modify, or refuse anything you want, except these key things. And so you have to sort of understand, like, what are the non-negotiables for your program? For us here in our program, a high fidelity housing first program at Pathways, some of those things are the frequency of home visits, right? And so folks do have to agree to allow us to visit them in their apartment. Our funder says that should happen at least once a month. The Housing First model says that it should happen once a week. And so we kind of settle right in the middle. We visit people at a minimum of once every 2 weeks, biweekly, visiting people in their homes, seeing how things are going, checking on things. Are there leaks? Anything you need to be addressed in the apartment? That kind of stuff. And so folks who, sometimes folks are resistant to this a little bit, but this is one of the key requirements. It's a non-negotiable thing in our program. But often we find that folks who are resistant to these visits are the ones that perhaps need that the most. I
wanted to jump in for a second and answer Rachel's question because it came at kind of a perfect time. So Rachel said, has anyone experienced once a participant is housed that they no longer want to engage with case managers? If so, how have you handled that and how does your program support it? So I'd love to hear other folks in the room kind of speaking to Rachel's question, but I want to talk a little bit about it in context of this slide, right? So it is optional, right, to engage in services. But what I want to say about that is, when we're really centering client goals, asking clients what it is they want to work on and in what order, it's pretty uncommon for folks to completely disengage from us, right? So usually what I say in response to things like this is, if they don't want what you're offering, offer what they want, right? Changing up your approach in the order in which we as providers, we think, oh, it makes sense for this person clearly needs to see a psychiatrist first, then go to rehab, or then work on getting a job. It makes sense to us for that to be the order in which they pursue these kind of like recovery oriented goals. But every now and again, we meet somebody who's just like, I want to get my birth certificate. first and foremost, before I don't even want a house. I need to get my birth certificate before I get an apartment. And to us, we're like, that doesn't make any sense. Let's just get you inside. You don't need your birth certificate. It's fine. And they're like, no, that's my goal. So we have to do that, right? When we do that, when we prioritize folks' goals and they see that they can accomplish their goal, right? The sense of achievement and mastery that comes from that opens up folks' ideas about what is possible for them, right? And eventually we do see when we can prioritize our clients' goals, eventually they work themselves around to the goals that we had for them in the first place, right? It's pretty rare that they don't eventually say, yeah, maybe I do want to change my relationship to substances, right? And I want to specifically note folks with opioid use disorder, right? In our program, 65% of folks with a primary diagnosis of opioid use disorder are accessing some form of treatment within 6 months of getting housed with us. I'm going to clarify why that statistic is very significant. The national average for all people in the United States who have an opioid use disorder, this includes people who have never experienced homelessness and have far fewer barriers than the folks we're working with, right? Nationally, 20% of people with an opioid use disorder ever enter treatment. We're more than tripling that number in 6 months of housing folks, and we don't force treatment or abstinence on anybody, right? I think this speaks to the idea of letting folks set the pace, identify their own goals, and pursue what they want to pursue in the order they want to do it, right? And on their own timelines. Folks get around to the goals that we would have for them anyway. We just got to let folks kind of lead the way and tell us where they want to go first. When folks completely disengage from us, it's usually because of past trauma with previous providers. They don't trust us, and why should they, right? Or that we're pushing goals on them that they're not interested in, and that's when they tell us to go away. So again, it's this idea of if they don't want what you're offering, offer what they want.
That's great. Thanks so much. I'll just really quickly answer one other question that I saw in the chat from Katrina. Katrina may know a little bit about Philadelphia and Kensington Avenue, which is kind of code for all the folks that are running around with opioid use disorders in the city. It's a real hotspot here in Philadelphia. And the question is, do we provide low barrier housing for those folks? And in fact, Pathways to Housing PA has really pioneered offering housing first, high fidelity housing first, to folks with a primary diagnosis of opioid use disorder in a scattered site model. We're the first to have done that in the country that we're aware of. And it's worked incredibly well, as indicated by some of the statistics. The statistics that Andrew just said. And those folks have a high level of need, but we have some really dedicated folks practicing harm reduction and kind of meeting folks where they're at. And so, yeah. So kind of the final non-negotiable we want to mention in terms of our program is that folks adhere to a standard lease agreement, and that includes a 30% program contribution, AKA rent. So 30% of their income goes towards rent. There are folks who have no income, and so we sort of disregard that and find other funding means for those contributions. But for folks who can contribute 30% of their income, sometimes we also assume payee-ship, and we'll do that without people's consent, but only when people's housing status is threatened. Like if they're going to be evicted, they're not paying their rent, whatever else is happening with their money, we'll sometimes assume payee-ship without consent, but only in those rare circumstances. But we do serve as the representative payee for people, as well as work with other outside partners that are representative payees for people's money.
I also want to mention around the assuming representative payee-ship, even when folks are not consenting to it, we really look at that as a harm reduction measure, right? Mm-hmm. If it's keeping somebody housed, that's in service of the ultimate goal. I want to say that that's also very complicated, very definitely strains the therapeutic relationship, right? And is not the most person-centered thing in the world. So these are not decisions that we make lightly, and we try as often as possible and as quickly as possible to have folks resume their own payee-ship in a way that feels best for them.
Thanks. So kind of moving past the engagement intervention and looking into treatment planning, one of the key strategies, I think, for a low barrier housing program is to have folks complete some of their own paperwork, right? Like take some ownership of their goals, and that includes some of their assessment and goal planning paperwork. And so all assessment paperwork here at Pathways is completed by the client with assistance from the staff. And so this really helps us to learn about them from them, right? These are what my goals are. Here are the steps that I want to pursue to get there. It also promotes buy-in, right? Like people have agency in this process. They're like, oh, this is my treatment plan. These are my strengths and needs. It allows people to be a part of the treatment process instead of sort of us doing treatment to people, right? Like it is a shared process. We're not like these end all be all experts that are like enforcing treatment on your head, right? No, like we're engaging in this together. And so that buy-in is really crucial. And it starts with some of the paperwork stuff. Our paperwork also, in this process of allowing them to complete it, sort of helps to clearly outline the role of the participant, of the staff, of the community, who are the other providers that might be involved in the process. Perhaps family would be involved. And so we include all of that in the treatment process and treatment planning process right from the get-go. Another thing that we sort of noticed and that we is interesting and helpful is that participants really don't want to be saved by us. And so in allowing folks to kind of set their own plans, set their own goals, people are able to see that they are taking ownership of their own lives and getting themselves out of the position that they are in themselves. Yeah, we're providing extra support and helping them meet their needs and offering suggestions and implementing harm reduction strategies. But folks really want to feel like they're controlling their own destiny and they're more likely to pursue and achieve their goals when they feel that way. So the kind of key approach here, and this applies to all of our services, but it starts here in treatment planning, is that we don't do things for people. We do things with them, in partnership with them, so that eventually they can do them independently. As Andrew mentioned, one of the kind of key principles of low barrier housing is social and community inclusion. And so that I think comes into play here too, right? Like getting out and making a life for yourself, whether that be through work or through recreation or through engaging in a faith community. We want folks to live their best lives and to achieve well-being. And so we do things in partnership with folks so that we can step out of the picture eventually. And that's evidenced through like our more recent alumni program that we have. We've had a number of graduates from our program where they flip over to like a city housing voucher and off of one of our HUD vouchers and are able to maintain that apartment on their own without us eventually, where we're not providing case management services anymore because they've reached the level of stability and status and confidence in their life that they don't need us anymore. And that's incredible. And so this is a complicated and somewhat messy process sometimes, especially as we engage in our creative harm reduction strategies. But the kind of guiding question that we can continue to ask ourselves, are we doing the right thing for folks? Is this partnership working the way that it should? Is how can I help? We're kind of always bringing it back to this question of how can I help? It's not you need to do this. If you do this part of the treatment process, then you'll achieve this result. It's how can I help you achieve what you want to achieve in your life, which is, I think, a pretty radical approach compared to some of the places where I've worked, where it's like you're kind of moving people along a treatment process that is not defined by them. And so, as we mentioned earlier, there is a lot of overlap with other evidence-based practices when we engage with low barrier housing. And so there are three kind of main evidence-based practices that we use pretty frequently and that overlap with the Housing First model. That's IDDT, RAP, and supported employment. And so all of these are really kind of client-driven. They're based on those humanistic values and principles, and they're all really integral to our service model. So we'll talk about those really briefly here. So IDDT, or Integrated Dual Disorders Treatment, it sort of acknowledges in a way that I hadn't seen prior to learning about Housing First. You know, I worked in a mental health recovery unit where we serve people with co-occurring disorders pretty regularly. And so folks would come in and see our psychiatrist for their mental health needs, and they would be actively using substances, and they'd say, "Oh no, you got to go deal with that with the substance use treatment provider, and then come back and see us." And on the flip side, we'd have people that were in the substance use program that would come over and they say, "Well, they told me I had to take care of my mental health first." And so IDDT sort of recognizes that these things happen at the same time, and we can treat them concurrently. So IDDT itself is a bit of an umbrella practice. It includes motivational interviewing and an understanding of the stages of change. It includes elements of CBT. as well as assertive engagement, which is so core to our process. And it includes seeking safety, which is kind of the co-occurring treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder along with substance use issues. And so there's a whole evidence-based practice behind that. So IDTT you see is like pretty wide ranging, but it really aligns really well with the work that we do here. The next one, come on, there we go, is WRAP, which is a component of wellness management and recovery, or you may have heard it as illness management and recovery, which is a recovery-focused process, especially targeted towards folks with mental health disorders. And so the WRAP is the Wellness Recovery Action Plan, and it's a plan that people hold themselves and develop themselves in partnership with us that really kind of talks about triggers. It talks about coping skills. It talks about like, who are my support systems? It's a really nice kind of crisis plan, but that's really kind of participant centered. Often we see peer specialists using this as a tool in partnership with folks that are trained on the use of WRAP. And so it takes that person environment perspective all together, really approaches people with respect and with non-judgment. It acknowledges people as experts on their own lives. Like, this is your recovery process. These are your coping skills that you say are going to work for you. Great. These are your triggers. Okay, let's apply those coping skills in the way that it's going to work best for you. You know yourself. You've been through a series of, let's say, hospitalizations or treatment programs. You know what it is, and so let's put that stuff down on paper so that you have a plan that you can kind of approach your next crisis point with. And of course, it uses quite a bit of person-first language. And then the final one. Come back, slide. So a number of other interventions that we include, SBIRT, or screening and brief intervention and referral to treatment. We see that, of course, quite a bit in our clinic, right, which is a primary care provider and can get people connected to treatment sources really quickly if needed. Critical time intervention. We'll talk a little bit in a second about the mental health recovery model, and everything is blanketed with a trauma-informed approach from the top down in our approaches to staff and our approaches to participants, and just a sort of an acknowledgement and a recognition of the significant impact of trauma on all of our lives. And so setting policy, setting procedures in ways that acknowledges that and is supportive of folks with that history. The mental health recovery model is one that is in use, especially here in Philadelphia. And we really like this slide because we think it really kind of maps pretty well to what we do here at Pathways. And so it's focused on helping people overcome or manage their disease or the symptoms of their disease. So it's focused on health. It's focused on having a home or a stable and safe place to live. It's focused on developing those social networks, those communities of folks, of people that can provide support, friendship, love, and hope for people. And so community is a big element of the mental health recovery model. And then lastly, having a purpose, right? Achieving recovery in the mental health world is about just living a life worth living, right? Conducting meaningful daily activities, things that people enjoy doing, having independence, having an income, and resources to participate in society as kind of just like everybody else. And so we think this maps really well to Housing First, which, you know, our logo here at our sort of motto here at Pathways is providing homes, restoring health, and reclaiming lives. And so you can see the health, the home, and the purpose and community really integrates pretty well there.
Awesome, thanks, Ryan. So we're closing in on our time here, and I wanted to spend a couple of minutes just thinking about this idea of, like, if you're working in a program that's not a low barrier program yet, right? You're interested in moving in that direction. You want to be taking more of a housing first approach. You know, where do you start? We talked about those 5 key principles. So chewing on those, talking about those with your teams. But when we think about what it means to reduce barriers and to kind of change the way we approach the work, here are some questions that might be helpful to reflect on, right? So asking ourselves, why is this particular policy or practice in place, right? Who does this policy serve? What does this practice serve? Rules in our programs are usually based on our values, right? We're humans. The people who are writing these rules and these policies are human beings, right? And we all have values and we all have implicit bias, right? That we don't always know is at play when we're developing these materials, right? So really thinking about, who does this serve? And then what does this rule or this policy or this practice communicate to the people that we serve? one of the things that Ryan and I do in our work is work with programs that are moving more towards a housing first or a low barrier approach, and they'll have us review their policies and procedures, right? And they'll say some programs are like, we're new to this and we want to move towards this, and other programs are like, oh yeah, we're already doing housing first, we're already doing harm reduction. And then we see their program policies and rules, and it's essentially like chastising their clients for mistakes they haven't even made yet, right? I really like, I mentioned that kind of like welcome home packet that we go through with our folks, which I feel like is sort of the idea of your program rules and responsibilities being sandwiched in a package called welcome home, right? What is that communicating to people that we serve? We're communicating like, we're so excited you're here and we want you to be as successful in your apartment as possible. And here's how we can do that, right? I see a lot of other programs that hand people a packet that they have to initial, like, I will not shove things down the toilet, right? I will take out my trash. And it's essentially like chastising people, right? For the things that they haven't even done wrong yet. So when we think about how we present our policies and how we make our policies and how we communicate them to folks, is like really thinking about what messages are we sending, right? Are the rules that we've created based on our own values? Because if they are, that's staff-centered, right? That's not client-centered. And we want to be doing client-centered work. So also thinking about how can we incorporate more choice into our programming? Who's got a seat at the table when we're making these decisions, when we're writing these policies? Are we including people with lived experience in our program design? And what opportunities do our clients have to actually give us feedback on what's working and what's not working, right? One of the ways we do this, all of our ACT teams have peer specialists, certified peer specialists, who are folks with lived experience, mental health recovery, substance use recovery, or recovery from homelessness, right? We also have attendance meeting that we offer once a month, where folks in our programming can come together with some staff members, and there's an agenda and they run through it and they talk about, all right, here's what's going well. Here are some complaints I have, right? And we take that information and we share it with folks on the executive team, right? And in the administration, so that we can make policies and procedures that are responsive to the needs of the folks that we're working with, right? So we can think when we're reducing barriers in our programming, right? Expectations can be about what we want our programs or our settings to feel like, right? Rather than rules. Rules are rigid. Rules don't take into account personal experiences, individuality, different barriers, different strengths. But we can say, we want our program to feel like a safe space for everybody, right? And how do we do that? How do we incorporate choice? How do we make it feel safe for different types of people, right? What is it that we want? Rather than having a rule, we can think about, what is it we want to get out of this rule? What kinds of behaviors do we want to promote versus discourage, right? I think an important piece of that too is separating substance use from behaviors, because this is one of the biggest sticking points for folks in housing, supportive housing services, is that person is gonna get evicted from their unit because they're using drugs. The drugs aren't the reason for the eviction. There might be behaviors that are associated or caused by that drug use. The behaviors are the thing that are gonna get somebody evicted, right? So if it's a lot of traffic in and out of the unit, the problem is the traffic, is having too many people over. Now, is the traffic because of drug use? Maybe. But the traffic can be addressed without saying somebody has to go to rehab, right? Can you go to your friend's house next time? Can you meet your friends in a public place rather than having them all to your unit, right? So separating those things can be one of the fastest ways that we can reduce barriers and move away from this kind of abstinence only approach, recovery approach, where we say, like, actually, we're going to meet people where they're at. We're not forcing, treatment. We're not forcing you to follow X, Y, and Z rules, but we can, again, separate your goals and your behaviors and look at how those things might not be lined up, right? How behaviors might not be in service of somebody's goals. So, in this note at the bottom, again, a lot of the fears that we have about low barrier housing and serving folks with substance use and mental illness revolve around our assumptions about how those folks are going to act, right? We can't help it. We are socialized in a world that has taught us to fear people who are experiencing poverty, people who are different from us, people with mental illness, people with substance use, right? So shifting to a low barrier approach means we have to spend a lot of time intentionally examining our biases and learning how to do that. Because if we don't, it's going to limit our capacity for real change in our programs. So a couple of key takeaways that I want to note here at the end, and then we're going to leave some couple of minutes for questions. We know that homelessness and co-occurring disorders do not stem from individual moral failings, right? Unfortunately, we're all working in a system that treats that as kind of the truth, right? So we have to do a lot of heavy lifting to get away from that. Low barrier housing services are really ideal for individuals who have been considered not ready for housing by traditional programs, right? So the idea is we're going to seek to meet a person's basic needs and then identify what additional goals might be and connect folks with the appropriate supports for that, right? We're centering client choice and self-determination in a highly individualized way, right? No standardized policies, no one size fits all, because that doesn't work for this population, right? So I like to think of it as like a metaphor where like participants are the captain of the ship and we as the staff are the crew, right? So we are, if one little water gets overboard, we're bailing it out, right? If one of the sails gets tangled up, we can help untangle it. But our participants are saying, here's where I want to go. This is the route I want to take to get there. That's what the captain does. And the crew just makes sure that the ship keeps sailing smoothly, right? So we can't control everything. We can't control the weather that we're going to face, right? There are going to be setbacks. There are going to be challenges, but the crew's got to be there to support the captain no matter what. And so that's our role. That's what we're doing. All right. What questions do folks have? I already see some coming through in the chat, but we also want to invite folks to just unmute, jump in, talk to us. Let's see. Is the last slide available? That would be a nice slide to blow up to remind staff what we are supposed to do. Yeah, we're going to send you a copy of these slides so you can do whatever you want with them. You can print them up and tack them up on your bulletin boards. We also have a couple of tip sheets that drill home some of like the really important takeaways, like the 5 key principles that we'll send along with a copy of these slides for you as well. Let's see, we had another question in the chat. How do you help your residents stay housed when those conversations have taken place, do drugs elsewhere, but the client just refuses to engage in order to stay housed? So yeah, that happens, right? Like sometimes we do everything in our power and everything right to try to keep somebody housed and they get evicted anyway, right? Like we have a lot of big-hearted, generous landlords who will work with some of our most difficult folks, but everybody's got a breaking point, right? And like, and eventually, if one of our participants is causing so much disruption that it's impeding on the quality of life in other people in the building, right? They're gonna get evicted. And we can't necessarily stop that, right? Sometimes eviction is sort of the event that can spur some real change, right? And can spur folks, ignite folks to think about something in a different way and consider changing their behaviors in a different way. In a housing first approach, even in the high fidelity housing first model, we expect that around 40% of our participants are going to lose their first apartment. It's just what we find, right? When folks have never lived independently before, it's really challenging, right, to get it right the first time. But we have continuing clinical conversations with those folks about those behaviors, and the rate at which we see folks lose their second apartment once they've been rehoused is cut in half, right? Or more than half, right? So there's a learning curve, right? And we just expect that like, we got to roll with the punches. Any long-term relationship is going to have some hiccups and some setbacks, right? Think about the friends you've had since childhood, or your spouse, or your kids, right? Like in any long-term relationship, There are problems, there are setbacks, but we continue to show up for folks and walk alongside them through, those disruption of services. And then when we walk through those events with folks, we build a lot of trust and a lot of rapport along the way. And we see that moving forward from that, kind of those statistics around losing housing and not engaging, they get better, right? Because we've built some trust with people.
Can I also just add that, the conversation is not, do drugs elsewhere or you're going to get evicted. It is much more about sort of like identifying a common goal, which is like for the participant to stay housed, right? And so if they truly identify that, yeah, I want to keep this apartment, then we're using our motivational interviewing skills and those interventions to really sort of like, okay, well, you say you want to get housed. There are a couple of options. Like this behavior is going to lead your landlord to evict you. That is going to be a natural consequence if this sort of continues to happen. And so we sort of explore, like, maybe it's do drugs elsewhere. Maybe it's invite people one at a time. Maybe it's any number of sort of creative strategies that we can come up with the ultimate, like, sort of shared goal of keeping that participant housed, right? Like if we can get on that same page first, the sort of interventions will follow that make sense for that participant. And so it's not do this or else, it's you want this, how can we help you keep it? Right. And so there's a lot more nuance in that conversation all along the way. And yeah, sometimes that conversation is easier to have after the first eviction, although we always want to kind of avoid that if we can.
And right now it's like we're talking about low barrier housing, right? But we could say like we're also talking about harm reduction at the same time, right? Keeping folks housed, keeping folks safe, keeping folks alive, right? We're doing harm reduction work, even when we're also doing this low barrier housing. When we do training series, we usually do like an intro to housing first and an intro to harm reduction. I always do the intro to harm reduction first, right? Because to me, you can do harm reduction without doing housing, but you can't do housing first or low barrier housing without harm reduction, right? So we usually kind of set the stage with harm reduction before we even talk about the housing first stuff. We've done it a little differently here today, but I want to just offer, these are a lot of the ideas that we're kind of going to explore and unpack and take some time to talk about in the harm reduction cohorts that we're offering. So just to give you kind of like a taste of what those look like, the intro session is 2 hours. We're really going to talk about stigma and risk and trauma and shame and stress and what that has to do with harm reduction work. We'll do a little what harm reduction is versus what harm reduction isn't, how we're all using harm reduction in our lives. We'll talk about the goals and the limitations and the outcomes of harm reduction practice. That's how we'll set the stage. The subsequent 5 weeks will be 1 hour sessions. So a smaller chunk of information, a lot of dialogue, a lot of problem solving. We want you to bring the cases that you're working with that you're really stumped on and you're really struggling with, so we can all share and problem solve together, right? So we'll spend time talking about harm reduction, the movement, the kind of political social justice movement versus harm reduction strategies, core principles of harm reduction, first language, applying harm reduction to all kinds of behaviors, not just drug use, right? We can apply harm reduction to housing. We can apply harm reduction to mental health. We can apply harm reduction to helping somebody keep a job, right? So talking about those kinds of things, we'll go over clinical strategies that we use in harm reduction. We'll explore themes of like accountability and enabling and rock bottom and ethics and comparing and contrasting kind of like 12-step themes with harm reduction work. We'll do some case studies. So we really encourage folks to come out for those. I think they'll be really interesting and really fun. So yeah. We're at 2:58. I'm happy to stick around and answer some more questions if we have them. Did anything else come through in the chat, Ryan?
There's a question much earlier, I think, that is a much more in-depth question that maybe we can address later, around like what if a lease agreement sort of conflicts with a low barrier approach? Like, do we have tools to navigate that? Actually, there were quite a number of questions and thoughts around working with landlords. How do we manage the lease? And that always generates a number of questions. And we know how difficult it is to sort of find landlords, keep landlords, get people on board with the program. We have a whole sort of training series around those questions because it's in depth. Affordable housing is an issue. And so everybody I know are looking for answers in that realm.
I'll say, you know, we can give some of that feedback too, and I'm sure Cassidy will pass along to the other folks at Rise that if folks are really hungry for some content on landlord engagement, like we can make that happen. So we'll forward that information along and see if that doesn't turn into another training or something later down the line. We'd love to be able to offer that for y'all because we do have some good information, some good resources that we love sharing with other people. I see Ryan dropped the link to the evaluation in the chat. Please fill those out for us. We really do look at every single one of them. We want to know your honest feedback about how we did today. So if we missed something entirely, or you want to hear more of something else, or you want additional trainings on different topics, please give us that info. We're going to look at it, and then we're going to aggregate it and send it to the folks at Rise so they'll know more about your needs as well. And we'll get you certificates in exchange for those. Cassidy, I saw you were about to jump in. I'm sorry I cut you off.
I was just going to say, yes, thank you everyone for all of your comments in the chat. I have taken many, many notes, and then we're going to bring it back to my team and see what we can do for some future trainings.
Awesome.
And thank you so much to Andrew and Ryan. This was so great.
Yeah, thanks for having us. So I'm going to send you an email in a little bit. It'll include the slides, some tip sheets, the link to the evaluation again, and then you'll have our email addresses so you can feel free to reach out to us if you need anything. And we hope to see a bunch more of you soon in the harm reduction cohorts. Hope everybody has a great rest of their day, great rest of the week.